On our wedding day, Samuel Anderson never showed up. Instead, his mother, Mrs. Anderson, answered a phone call and told us Samuel had been rushed to the hospital. Leukemia. Emergency surgery. I didn't even stop to think. When she handed me the bone marrow donation papers, I signed them without hesitation. But I never made it out of that operating room. I lost my life on that cold, sterile table. And the baby I was carrying? Gone too. Even in my demise, my soul couldn't rest. I needed to see him, needed to look at the man I had loved for 6 years one last time. But when I found him, the truth hit harder than the end itself ever could. Samuel was perfectly fine. Not a trace of illness. He was lounging in our bedroom, holding another woman, his so-called true love, Eleanor, in his arms. It worked out perfectly. He said with a smirk, his voice calm and casual. Selling her off gave us just enough cash to keep the company afloat. And now, Eleanor purred, curling up closer to him. We can finally be together. Just like you promised. It was all a lie. The illness, the surgery, it was nothing but a twisted scheme. He had used me, drained me, and discarded me, all for her. My love, my life, my trust, everything I had given him was nothing more than a means to an end. But then, I opened my eyes. It was the morning of our wedding. This time, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. This time, I'd destroy him so thoroughly that he'd never recover. Chapter 1. Back at the wedding. I was standing at the wedding venue again, but this time, there wasn't even a trace of the excitement I'd felt in my last life. All I had now was an overwhelming sense of hatred. I knew exactly where Samuel was, off with his true love. Eleanor, whispering sweet promises to each other while I stood here, waiting to be humiliated. What was supposed to be the happiest day of my life would end in betrayal. By the end of the day, Samuel and his mother would try to take my life. And in my previous life, I had walked right into their trap, blind and trusting. The thought made my chest ache. 6 years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice all reduced to this. The memory of Samuel and Eleanor tangled in each other's arms haunted me like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But I didn't have the luxury of dwelling on the past. Time was running out, and I needed a way to break free. Survival was the only way to rewrite this story. This wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. Samuel had no intention of showing up. Last night, I was so restless that I couldn't sleep. By a.m., I had already gotten up, done my makeup, and prepared myself for the day ahead. I had been so caught up in the anticipation of what was to come that I'd barely noticed how lightheaded I felt. Now, standing under the bright lights, the dizziness hit me hard. I staggered slightly and made my way to one of the tables, grabbing a piece of candy to steady myself. Before I could catch my breath, Mrs. Anderson stormed over and shoved me hard. I stumbled, the long dress tangling around my legs, and fell flat onto the ground in front of everyone. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. "Have we treated you so poorly that you have to steal from the guests?" The room went silent as dozens of eyes turned toward me. Judging. Mocking. Laughing. Mrs. Anderson had never missed an opportunity to humiliate me, especially in front of others. She always claimed it was to keep me humble so I wouldn't bully Samuel after we got married. In my last life, I had swallowed my pride time and time again, convincing myself it wasn't worth making a scene. After all, she was my future mother-in-law, and I didn't want to put Samuel in an awkward position. But my patience had only encouraged her cruelty. And Samuel? He had never once defended me. Not a single word. What made it worse was that everything about this wedding, the decorations, the favors, the arrangements, had been handled by me. Every penny spent came from my pocket. The Anderson family hadn't contributed a thing. And yet, here I was, being treated like a thief for eating my own candy. I clenched my fists and took a deep breath. If I was going to start taking my life back, I wasn't going to let anyone push me around anymore. Not even for a second. Slowly, I got up, brushed myself off, and walked to the center of the room. "Everyone, listen up," I said, my voice calm but clear. This wedding is cancelled. There won't be a marriage." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and murmurs of disbelief filled the air. I could feel their stares boring into me, their confusion palpable. After all, Samuel and I were the perfect couple, or so they thought. We'd been together since university, the golden pair everyone envied. But they didn't know the truth. That perfection had been held together by my endless sacrifices and my constant effort to make things work. And the reality was I was always the one left behind, the one who gave and gave, only to be discarded in the end. Mrs. Anderson's face twisted into an awkward smile as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Felicia," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Let's not blow things out of proportion. Samuel has been so busy with the company lately. Isn't it understandable if he's running a little late? Can't you show him some understanding?" She tilted her head, her tone turning condescending. "And really, all I did was scold you a little. Was that enough to throw a tantrum?" It was true that Samuel's company had been struggling lately. What Mrs. Anderson didn't know was that I was the company's largest shareholder. My original plan had been to reveal my identity as the Clark family heiress at the wedding. My family had always opposed me marrying a man like Samuel, who came from nothing. But I thought that once we were married, my father would have no choice but to help him save his company. Looking back, I couldn't believe how naive I had been. I had poured everything into this relationship, thinking my love and sacrifice would make it all work. But all it had done was make me look like a fool. "Samuel's been missing since last night," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. "He hasn't shown up today either. Anyone would find that suspicious." My gaze locked onto Mrs. Anderson's, cold and unflinching. "And now, you're trying to blame me? Are you deliberately covering for him, or are you just trying to shift the focus off of his absence?" Her smile faltered, but I didn't stop. If he can't even be bothered to show up to his own wedding, it's not just disrespectful to me, it's an insult to every single guest here. And frankly, I don't see the point in marrying someone like that. I turned on my heel, ready to leave, when a sudden ringtone broke the tense silence. Mrs. Anderson quickly pulled out her phone and raised it high, forcing another smile as she addressed the crowd. "Everyone, don't listen to her nonsense," she said loudly, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Samuel's secretary calling. I'm sure there's a perfectly good reason for all of this." Chapter 2. The moment the call connected, I heard Eleanor's syrupy voice on the other end. "Mrs. Anderson, it's awful," she said, feigning panic. "Mr. Anderson has just been diagnosed with acute leukemia. They're rushing him to the hospital right now." "What?" Mrs. Anderson gasped, her voice rising with alarm. "What did the doctor say? Is it serious?" "They said the only option now is a bone marrow transplant," Eleanor replied, her tone dripping with fake concern. Then, as if it had just occurred to her, she added, "Oh, and isn't Felicia the same blood type as Samuel? Maybe she could donate." Her words were deliberate and perfectly calculated to shift everyone's attention to me. Mrs. Anderson's head whipped toward me, her eyes lighting up with sudden hope as she rushed forward. "Felicia!" she cried, reaching for my hand. "You and Samuel have the same blood type, don't you? Please, for all the years you've been together, can't you help him? I'm begging you as his mother." I stepped back, smoothly avoiding her grasp, and gave her a pointed look. In my last life, this was exactly how it had happened. The moment I heard Samuel was in danger, I'd been so blinded by love and panic that I'd agreed without a second thought. This time, I wasn't falling for it. I crossed my arms and watched her little performance unfold, my expression cold and unmoving. I still remembered the excruciating pain of that surgery, the icy, mechanical sounds of the operating room, the way my body had been torn apart, only to suffer for their lies. Not again. Mrs. Anderson's outstretched hand froze in midair. For a moment, she hesitated, clearly thrown off by my reaction. She was used to a Felicia who would bend over backward to accommodate her every whim, Not this version of me. Her hesitation didn't last long. Her gaze darkened, and I caught a glimpse of the malice flickering behind her carefully constructed mask. Turning toward the Anderson family relatives seated among the guests, she raised her voice, dripping with emotion. "Everyone, please help me talk some sense into Felicia," she pleaded dramatically. "This is a critical situation. Isn't this when true love is supposed to shine? Samuel has always treated her so well. How could she turn her back on him now?" The Anderson relatives, ever eager to side with their own, immediately chimed in. "Felicia, how could you be so cold? He's your fiancé. You're supposed to support each other. Don't be ungrateful. Think about everything Samuel has done for you." I almost laughed. The hypocrisy was truly something to behold. I held up a hand to silence them, my voice cutting through their chatter. "Do any of you actually understand how this works? Matching blood types is just the first step. A full match isn't guaranteed. And besides, aren't direct relatives far more likely to be compatible?" The room fell quiet. For once, they seemed caught off guard. Thankfully, some of my friends had started to catch on. One of them stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "She's right. Why are you all ganging up on her? There are plenty of other possible matches. You can't just force her into this." Mrs. Anderson's face tightened as her plan began to unravel. But she wasn't giving up that easily. Her eyes darted around the room, and in the next second, she let out a loud, theatrical sob. "You're all bullying me," she wailed, her voice cracking with anguish. "I'm just an old woman who doesn't know anything about these complicated medical procedures. The doctor said she's a match. How can you all stand here and argue with me?" She clutched her chest dramatically, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, God! I only have one son. And now the heavens have cursed me with a daughter-in-law who's so heartless, so cruel. How can she just stand there and refuse to save him?" Her performance was so over the top that I almost wanted to applaud. But I wasn't going to let her get the upper hand. Pulling out my phone, I quickly dialed my private doctor. "Hello, Dr. Mills," I said, my voice calm and steady as I hit the speaker button. Holding up the MC's microphone, I turned to face the crowd. "Could you explain to everyone here how bone marrow matching actually works?" Dr. Mills' voice came through the speakers, professional and matter-of-fact. He explained the process in detail, emphasizing that immediate family members were far more likely to be successful matches. The room fell silent as his explanation echoed through the venue. I turned back to Mrs. Anderson, fixing her with a cold stare. "Did you hear that, Mrs. Anderson?" I said, my tone sharp and unwavering. "I only have one husband. I'd hate to end up with a mother-in-law who would rather let him suffer than donate her own bone marrow." Her face twisted in fury as the crowd murmured in agreement. For a moment, I thought she might actually explode. But then, her expression shifted. Her eyes narrowed, and I saw the true malice behind them. "Felicia," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Let me make this very clear. You're going to donate that bone marrow whether you like it or not." Before I could respond, a group of large, burly men stepped forward, surrounding me. I recognized them immediately as the Anderson family's hired thugs. Two of them grabbed my arms, their grip like steel, and started dragging me toward the door. My friends tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered and quickly shoved aside. I struggled against their hold, panic rising in my chest. The harder I fought, the tighter their grip became. I couldn't deny it, I was scared. In my last life, it had never escalated to this point. But fear wasn't going to stop me. As they dragged me toward the exit, I reached into my pocket and pressed the emergency quick dial button on my phone. Chapter 3. I barely had time to process what was happening before I was dragged into the hospital, one I recognized all too well. In my last life, they hadn't even bothered to test if I was a match. Instead, they had shoved me straight onto the operating table like an object to be used. I could still remember the cold sting of the needle piercing my flesh, the sharp, shuddering pain that made my entire body tremble. Samuel never intended for me to survive. He'd taken everything from me, my health, my dignity, my life, and left me with nothing. The thought made my stomach churn. And the cruel irony? This hospital had been part of a company acquisition I'd spearheaded, meant to improve healthcare benefits for our employees. Yet here it was, being used by Samuel to play God with my life. With a rough shove, the goons dragged me into the operating room and threw me down onto the cold, steel table. Pain shot up my spine as I hit the surface, but I bit down hard, refusing to cry out. I couldn't give up here. Not yet. I hadn't even started my revenge. Mrs. Anderson's voice cut through the sterile silence, sharp and mocking. You really thought you could humiliate me in front of everyone and get away with it? You're braver than I gave you credit for. She waved a hand at the doctor, her lips curling into a sneer. Tie her down. The doctor hesitated, his hands trembling as he glanced between me and the angry woman before him. Don't even think about touching me. I snapped, my voice ringing with authority. I am the heiress of the Clark Corporation. Lay a finger on me, and I'll make sure you all live to regret it. The room went still. For a brief moment, the doctor froze, his face going pale. Mrs. Anderson, however, burst into laughter, the sound cold and cruel. You? She sneered, looking me up and down with disdain. The Clark heiress? What a joke. Take a good look at yourself. You think anyone would believe that nonsense? But the doctor wasn't so quick to dismiss me. He hesitated, glancing nervously at Mrs. Anderson. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her last name is Clark, after all. The other staff exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. Everyone in this city knew the Clark family's reputation. Crossing them meant trouble, serious trouble. Mrs. Anderson's composure slipped for a moment, but her rage quickly returned. She kicked the doctor hard in the shin, grabbing the syringe from his hand. Idiots! She snapped, her voice rising. She's bluffing. If she's really the Clark heiress, then I'll get down on my knees and kowtow 10 times. She stormed toward me, raising the syringe with trembling hands. But I wasn't about to let her win. As soon as she got close enough, I lunged forward and bit down on her arm as hard as I could. Her scream echoed through the room as she staggered back, clutching her arm. What are you all standing around for? She shrieked, her voice laced with fury. Hold her down. The goons didn't hesitate this time. They pinned me down on the table, gripping my arms and legs with a force that left me no room to fight back. Mrs. Anderson stalked toward me, her face twisted with rage. She raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. You little bitch. She spat, her voice shaking with anger. She slapped me again, harder this time, until my vision blurred and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. But I refused to look away. I lifted my head, meeting her gaze with cold, unwavering defiance. I warned you. I said, my voice steady despite the pain. You'll regret this. Her lips curled into a cruel smile. Regret? She said, her voice dripping with venom. Look at you. You're nothing but a pathetic little worm. What could you possibly do to me? She grabbed the syringe again, raising it high above her head. Let's end this, shall we? She said, her voice cold and triumphant. But before she could strike, a piercing scream filled the room. It wasn't mine. I turned my head and saw a familiar figure storm into the room. It was Butler William, the man who had raised me since I was a child. He had Mrs. Anderson's arm twisted behind her back in a grip so tight that she dropped the syringe with a clatter. Who dares to behave so outrageously? He thundered, his voice filled with authority. Before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the tension, deep and commanding. Stand aside. The crowd parted, and there he was, my father. He strode into the room with the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier, his sharp, steely gaze sweeping over everyone. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had seen this man broken before, crushed by grief after my demise in my previous life. He had aged overnight, his strong, proud figure bent under the weight of loss. But now, here he was, larger than life and very much alive. Tears burned in my eyes, but I held them back. The doctor was the first to react, stumbling over his words as his face turned ghostly pale. Mr. Clark. I didn't realize you were here. Mrs. Anderson, too, quickly adjusted her tone, her face twisting into a forced smile. Mr. Clark, she said, her voice trembling. This is just a small family misunderstanding. We didn't expect you to grace us with your presence. My father's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile. A family misunderstanding? He repeated, his tone icy. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Anderson, his eyes narrowing. If I hadn't come when I did, he said, his voice low and dangerous, my daughter would be gone right now. Chapter 4. What? Mrs. Anderson flinched, her expression faltering for just a moment before she quickly masked it. Her mind was clearly racing, scrambling for a way to turn the situation around. Surely, no one had seen what she'd done earlier. And Felicia, her obedient, spineless daughter-in-law-to-be, had never stood up to her before. Why was she acting so out of character today? But she had no better options. She'd have to gamble one last time. Felicia, darling, she began, forcing a weak smile onto her face. It was all just a misunderstanding, really. I was just panicking, thinking about Samuel. You love him so much, don't you? Of course, you'd want him to get better. Her voice dripped with fake warmth, every word carefully crafted to manipulate me. I could see it as clear as day. In the past, I would have fallen for it. I would have let her words crawl under my skin, let the guilt she wielded like a weapon push me into submission. Not anymore. I let her squirm in the silence for a moment, my expression calm and unreadable. Then, I tilted my head slightly and said, "Oh, I understand. You're just so worried about your son. But you do realize, don't you, that if my family, the Clark family, wanted to, we could crush Samuel's entire company with a single phone call?" Mrs. Anderson's face drained of color as the weight of my words settled over her. The haughty, overbearing woman from earlier was nowhere to be seen now. She nodded vigorously, even clasping her hands together in a pitiful gesture of submission. It was pathetic. And deeply satisfying. But I wasn't done with her yet. A slow smile spread across my lips, one I knew wasn't kind. If you want forgiveness, I continued, my voice soft but razor sharp, why don't you follow through on what you said earlier? Go ahead. Kowtow. 10 times. Her eyes widened in shock, and I could see the horror in her expression as she realized I wasn't joking. You... She started, but the words caught in her throat. I held her gaze, my smile never faltering. She must have seen something in my expression, something dark and unrelenting, because she seemed to shrink back, her bravado crumbling. Mrs. Anderson took an unsteady step backward and then another before her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. I could see the battle raging inside her, humiliation, rage, and desperation all tangled together. In the end, desperation won. She lowered her head to the ground, her movements stiff and jerky. 1, 2, 3. Her forehead hit the floor with a dull thud each time, the sound echoing in the quiet room. By the 8th kowtow, a faint trace of blood had appeared on her skin, smearing against the cold, hard floor. When she finally dared to lift her head, her face was pale, her voice trembling. "Felicia, please." "Clark." I interrupted, my tone icy. "Miss Clark." Her lips quivered, but she forced herself to correct herself. "Miss Clark, can I stop now? I'm so sorry." I tilted my head as if considering her words and then let my smile widen, slow, deliberate, cruel. "No." Her head shot up, her expression stunned. "What?" She gasped, her voice barely audible. "I said no. I won't forgive you." Her shock quickly turned to panic. I could see her mind scrambling for a way out, her eyes darting around the room. She reached for her phone, desperate to call for help. But I was already 2 steps ahead. I glanced at her, who stepped forward and kicked the phone out of her hand without so much as a word. "Take her phone," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And while you're at it, make sure she gets tested for compatibility. She's not leaving this hospital until I say so." Mrs. Anderson tried to protest, but it was no use. 2 guards grabbed her, one of them clamping a hand over her mouth as they dragged her out of the room. I didn't bother to watch her go. Let her stew in her humiliation for a while. I was in no rush. Samuel and his family had taken everything from me in my last life, and I intended to repay them slowly, piece by agonizing piece. The room emptied quickly after that, leaving only me and my father. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before meeting his gaze. "I don't want to marry Samuel," I said, my voice steady and resolute. My father studied me for a moment, his sharp eyes softening slightly. He sighed quietly and then stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "All right," he said simply. "Let's go home." The word home settled over me, warm and heavy. As we sat in the car, driving away from the chaos of the hospital, everything felt strangely surreal. It was as though I were caught between 2 timelines, the pain of my past life and the hope of this second chance. My father's presence beside me felt solid and real, his broad shoulders a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone this time. I leaned back against the seat, letting the tension in my body slowly drain away. It wasn't too late. I still had time, but the memories of my previous life refused to let me rest. Samuel's betrayal, his cruelty, the way he had destroyed my family even after he'd murdered me, it all came rushing back, a storm of rage and grief that threatened to swallow me whole. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. This time, I wouldn't let any of them get away with it. This time, I'd protect the people I loved. Chapter 5. When I finally stepped back into the comfort of my family home, the weight of the day's events seemed to lift just slightly. Sitting in the living room, I told my parents everything that had happened. My mother gripped my hands tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it," she cried, her voice trembling with anger. "I told you Samuel wasn't someone you could trust with your future. How dare they treat you like this?" My father, his expression grim, slammed his hand against the table. "I'll make sure every company blacklists him. Nobody crosses the Clark family and gets away with it, especially not my daughter." Their fierce protectiveness warmed my heart, but I quickly shook my head, stopping them before they could take action. "Mom, Dad," I said gently, "I know you're upset for me, and I can't tell you how much it means to me. But, please let me handle this. I promise I won't let him off easily, but I need to do this on my own terms. I won't make the same mistakes again. Just trust me." It took a lot of convincing before they reluctantly backed down. They didn't know the full extent of what I'd been through, not the betrayal, not the heartbreak, not the horrors of my previous life. All they wanted was for me to stay far away from Samuel and his toxic family. Looking at them now, so young and full of life, I silently made a promise to myself. This time, they wouldn't have to worry about me. After dinner, I retreated to my bedroom. In my last life, I had spent so much time running around for Samuel, fighting his battles, fixing his problems, that I couldn't even remember the last time I'd come home. Now, lying on my bed, the soft mattress cradling me in a way that felt almost foreign, I couldn't stop the tears from coming. I'd spent 6 years of my life with Samuel. 6 years of believing in him, trusting him, loving him, and for what? To find out the man I thought I knew was nothing more than a monster. Deep down, I'd always had my suspicions about him and Eleanor. The signs were there, but I ignored them. Every time a doubt crept in, I pushed it aside, letting my love for him blind me to the truth. But betrayal alone wasn't enough for him. He didn't just break my heart, he tried to take my life. I wiped my face and took a deep breath, forcing myself to push the emotions aside. There was no time for self-pity. I needed to think clearly. I stayed awake the entire night, piecing together every step of my plan. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted, but my resolve had never been stronger. The next morning, I dragged myself downstairs to breakfast, dark circles under my eyes. Growing up, I'd always been the type to sleep in whenever I was home, so when my parents saw me up so early, they couldn't hide their surprise. I walked over to my mom and wrapped my arms around her, resting my head on her shoulder like a little girl. "I just wanted to spend more time with you," I said softly, a hint of playfulness in my voice. We spent the morning together, enjoying the quiet comfort of family. It was a rare, peaceful moment, and I savored every second of it. But peace was a luxury I couldn't afford for long. By mid-morning, I had changed and was ready to leave. William dropped me off at the apartment Samuel and I once called our marital home. The moment I stepped inside, the memories hit me like a wave. I had poured my heart into this place, crafting it into the perfect home. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, it was all chosen with love and care, all part of the future I thought we'd share. I dreamed of raising our children here, of building a happy life together. Now, all I felt was disgust. I clenched my fists, biting back the nausea rising in my throat, and forced myself to head toward the master bedroom. My body felt heavier with every step, but I kept moving. If my past life had played out the same way this time around, then yesterday would have been the day I perished in the hospital. And while I had bled out on that cold operating table, Samuel and Eleanor had been here, celebrating their freedom in the bed I had once lovingly made. I pushed open the door. The stench hit me immediately, a sickening mix of sweat and cheap perfume. The sheets were tangled in a mess, stained and disheveled. Paper scraps and other trash littered the floor, and the quilt my mother had painstakingly hand-stitched lay crumpled in a corner like garbage. I stared at the quilt for a long moment, my heart twisting. My mother had spent nights sewing it by hand, pouring her love into every thread. Now, it lay abandoned on the floor, a perfect metaphor for the marriage I had once foolishly believed in. I took a deep breath, swallowing the anger that threatened to boil over. Destroying this place would be satisfying, but it wouldn't get me what I needed. I had to stay focused. Pulling out the small cameras I'd brought with me, I carefully set them up around the room. Every angle was covered, and every corner was accounted for. If Samuel and Eleanor thought they could continue their little game, they were in for a rude awakening. Once I was done, I stepped back to inspect my work. Perfect. Suppressing my emotions, I made my way to the living room and sank into the couch. Crossing my legs, I leaned back and waited. It didn't take long. Soon, I heard the sound of laughter and playful teasing outside the door. Their voices grew louder, and then came the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. Eleanor's voice rang out, bright and bubbly, as though she were some blissful newlywed. If I didn't know better, I might have believed they truly were in love. The door creaked open, and Samuel stepped inside, his arm draped casually around Eleanor's shoulders. The moment his eyes landed on me, he froze. I smiled at him from the couch, calm and composed, as though I had been waiting for him all along. His face turned ashen, and for a split second, I thought he might actually bolt back out the door. Chapter 6. I could see the panic in Samuel's eyes. He was terrified, and I knew exactly why. By his calculations, I wasn't supposed to be here. I didn't give him time to regain his composure. Standing up with a smile, I spoke first, my voice light and full of concern. "Samuel? You're back already? I've been so worried about you." My calm tone seemed to throw him off. He hesitated and then carefully asked, "Felicia, why are you here?" I raised an eyebrow and tilted my head as if confused. "What kind of question is that? This is my home too, isn't it? But what about you? Why aren't you still at the hospital? I was so scared something might happen to you." His guilty expression deepened, and his words came out in a stammer. "All right. The doctor said, it's still early, so I didn't have to stay in the hospital. That's why I came back home." "Liar." His voice faltered with every word, his eyes darting nervously like a cornered animal. "And your mom?" I asked casually, tilting the conversation in another direction. His reaction was immediate. My mom? He repeated stiffly. You haven't seen her? I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. It was a calculated question. Mrs. Anderson should have been handling everything yesterday to ensure I never made it out of the hospital. Feigning innocence, I gave him a puzzled look. No, I haven't. I went to the hospital yesterday to try to save you, but the doctor said we weren't a match. After that, your mom talked to the doctor and left with him. I haven't heard from her since. That's strange. Samuel muttered, frowning. Of course, it was. They had everything planned out whether I was a match or not. I was never supposed to leave the hospital alive. I sighed, pretending to be hurt. What do you mean by that? Are you saying you don't believe me? After everything I did for you yesterday? He snapped out of his thoughts immediately, shaking his head in panic. No, of course not. I would never doubt you. I know you're the best wife anyone could ask for. Despite his words, his eyes kept flickering toward the master bedroom. Subtle, but not subtle enough. I raised an eyebrow, giving him a teasing smile. What's wrong? Is someone hiding in there? His face turned ghostly pale, the blood draining so fast that I had to fight back a laugh. Before he could manage a response, I waved it off. Relax, I'm just teasing you. Honestly, Samuel, you're so easy to scare. I glanced at my watch and added. Anyway, I need to head back to my parents' place. There's something I need to take care of. As I walked past him, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor awkwardly pressed against the wall, her face stiff with tension. I paused just long enough for my words to land. Oh, I said with a sweet smile, my voice dripping with mock sincerity. Your little secretary is here too? How thoughtful. Be sure to take good care of Mr. Anderson tonight, won't you? I didn't wait for a response. Without another glance, I turned and walked out the door. Back at home, I stretched out on my bed, a satisfied smirk playing on my lips. How long had it been since I'd felt this free? No more bending over backward for Samuel, no more spinning in circles to please him. This peace, this quiet, it felt foreign, but I welcomed it with open arms. I let my thoughts drift toward tomorrow. Maybe I'd spend the day shopping. A little retail therapy sounded like exactly what I needed. Before I could entertain the idea any further, a soft ding from my laptop snapped me back to reality. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The surveillance software I had installed had picked up activity. Sliding into my chair, I opened the feed. On the screen, Samuel and Eleanor were sitting on the edge of the bed, their heads close together. I turned up the volume, and their voices filtered through the speakers. Samuel, what's going on? You told me she wouldn't come back. Eleanor's voice was sharp, her irritation barely masked. You didn't see her this morning. Samuel muttered. She was practically bragging, acting like she had everything under control. Eleanor pouted, but it was all for show. Her body betrayed her as she leaned closer to him, resting her head on his shoulder. You better not be lying to me, Samuel. His frustration was evident as he frowned. I'm not lying. I don't know what went wrong. Hold on, I'll call and find out. Hearing the name made my stomach twist. The man Samuel had hired to orchestrate his sick plan to sell my bone marrow. Samuel dialed the number, and a gruff voice answered on the other end. Mr. Zachary. Samuel started, his voice low. What happened yesterday? I brought her to you exactly like we agreed. You think I don't know that? Mr. Zachary snapped. Listen, the heat's on right now. The higher-ups are cracking down hard. This kind of deal isn't going to fly anymore. What? Samuel's voice rose in panic. But what about the money you promised me? Money? Mr. Zachary barked out a bitter laugh. You're lucky I didn't get arrested. The deal's off. Don't call me again. The line went silent, leaving Samuel staring at his phone, his hands trembling. This can't be happening. He muttered. Without that money, how are we going to keep the company afloat? Eleanor leaned closer, her voice soft and sweet as she ran a hand along his cheek. Don't stress, darling. I checked with the accounting department earlier. They said we have enough to last another month. Samuel didn't seem reassured. Eleanor gave him a sly smile. Besides, you're resourceful. If this deal doesn't work, you'll just have to find another way. Worst case scenario, we can always sell her again. She's not going anywhere, is she? Even though I'd already known about their plans, hearing it with my own ears was like being stabbed in the chest. I sat there frozen, as tears slid down my face. I had thought my heart was numb by now, hardened beyond feeling, but some wounds, it seemed, still cut to deep. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to focus. I clicked the save button, locking the recording away as evidence. Originally, I hadn't intended to deal with Eleanor. To me, the responsibility for betrayal always fell on the man. If Samuel hadn't chosen her, it would have been someone else, another Eleanor, another pawn. But now, I saw her for what she really was. She wasn't just complicit, she was an active participant, just as eager to see me gone as he was. Fine. If Eleanor liked selling people so much, I'd make sure she got a taste of her own medicine. This debt? She'd pay it with interest. Chapter 7. In the midst of planning my revenge on Samuel and Eleanor, I almost forgot about the company. When Samuel graduated, he couldn't find a job. With his arrogant yet incompetent nature, he couldn't accomplish much. But I pitied him and cared about his pride, so I secretly used my family's connections to get him a job. The company's financial problems were expected. I never intended for him to achieve much, just hoped we could be together. I had planned to secretly help him through this crisis after our wedding, but then this happened. I called the company to understand the situation. I learned that the company was in chaos. Many of the capable employees I had hired had left because Eleanor was running the place like her personal fiefdom, and currying favor with the boss had become a trend. I had a headache and told the person reporting to me to stop. Contact the former employees and have them come to my other company under my name. Explain the situation to them. And don't assign any more work to Samuel. I don't want this company anymore. Keep this confidential. I would keep the company as a facade for them while transferring all the business elsewhere. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. I went downstairs and saw my father still awake. I walked over and leaned on his shoulder. Dad, why are you still up? You little rascal, why aren't you asleep? It's different for you. I want you to age slowly and stay with me. I pressed my face against his. He put down his newspaper and looked at me closely. Why do I feel like our Felicia has changed? Grown up? Caring about us now. Don't worry about us. As long as you're happy and healthy, your mom and I are satisfied. My nose tingled, and I hugged him tightly. Hey, I just said you've grown up, and now you're acting like a little girl. I didn't say anything, just held him tightly, this man who truly cared for me. Chapter 8. With the company's issues temporarily resolved, I prevented further damage. I also secretly monitored Samuel's phone to prevent him from contacting others. Samuel cared most about his career and reputation, so I would target his weaknesses. The month Eleanor mentioned was almost up. Samuel was as anxious as a cat on a hot tin roof. Without money, how could he be with his beloved Eleanor? Eleanor wasn't easy either. When Samuel was the boss, he spent tens of thousands every month to please his beloved. Now, with no money, Eleanor often threw tantrums. Gradually, his beloved became a burden. Samuel's face was constantly troubled, unable to spare the energy to placate Eleanor. He even started thinking of me, his neglected wife. For the past month, I had been pretending the company was struggling, barely able to afford food. Samuel ate bread and pickles daily, looking pitiful. I decided whether to help him based on my mood. One evening, after a satisfying dinner at home, I brought leftovers to Samuel. I even bought a few bottles of his favorite wine. Samuel devoured the leftovers, making me feel disgusted. I wondered how I ever liked this man. I handed him a bottle of wine and started drinking. After a few rounds, Samuel's gaze softened. Felicia, you were with me when I started the company. Now that I'm down, you're still here. It's good to have you. I dodged his attempt to hold my hand and began my performance. We've been together for 6 years. Who else would I be with? This statement was half true, half from the Felicia who once loved him and half from the Felicia who had crawled out of hell. Samuel, remember Mr. Zachary from the party? He secretly asked for my contact, offering $5,000 a night. Everyone knew the Zachary family was the second wealthiest after the Thomas family. The head of the family was known for his extravagant lifestyle, with many assets of dubious origin. This time, I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone and eliminate a competitor for the Thomas family. Really? Would you do that for me? Felicia. My gentle gaze turned cold. Of course I would. Not. Samuel, already drunk, slumped over the table. I called William. William, everything is ready. How about your side? It was only 10 at night, the nightlife just beginning. I arrived at the agreed location, where William was waiting at the front desk. We exchanged glances, and I walked to the stage. Everyone's here. I apologize for the wedding incident. Tonight's dinner is on Mr. Samuel. The crowd cheered, some asking why Samuel wasn't present. Suppressing my excitement, I said, "Don't worry about Samuel. We've invited all the company's employees to thank you for your support. The company has finally overcome its difficulties. Mr. Samuel asked me to show you the company's recent progress." The screen behind me lit up. But instead of company updates, the screen showed 2 bodies entwined. The crowd was in an uproar. I pretended to be shocked, but everyone was fixated on the screen. As the scene reached its climax, the faces of Samuel and Mr. Zachary were revealed. Chapter 9. The scandal spread quickly, and Samuel's reputation was ruined. The sleeping pills were strong, and by the time he woke up, his phone was flooded with messages. I woke up early to watch his reaction. Seeing the messages, Samuel, exhausted from the previous night, nearly fainted. I slapped him awake. What happened? I need to go to the hospital. Samuel, with dark circles under his eyes, almost screamed. I don't know. Eleanor said you had a plan to make money. Honey, we can't afford the hospital. Wake up. I buried my face in my arms, stifling my laughter. Where's Eleanor? Get her here. She's been dating recently. Yes, I had arranged for a friend, a small business owner, to play with her. Samuel's face darkened, and I added fuel to the fire. What's wrong, honey? She's a young girl. She deserves to date. You can't expect her to work for the company forever. He finally passed out, and no amount of slapping woke him. I saw him again 3 days later. He looked even more haggard, no longer the confident man he once was. But Eleanor was back by his side. I heard Samuel had reported the incident, but Mr. Zachary had settled it with money. It was a form of selling. I was in a great mood. If Eleanor liked selling, let's see who sold better. The 2 seemed to have reconciled, but they didn't know I was in control. When I learned Samuel had received compensation, I had my friend cool off towards Eleanor. As expected, she returned to leech off Samuel. Compared to the haggard Samuel, I looked radiant. Since my rebirth, I had been doing beauty treatments and working out. I felt like I was back to my college days, before I devoted myself to a man. Seeing me, Eleanor's eyes filled with jealousy. Sister-in-law, Samuel is working so hard for the company, and you still have time to dress up. Are you looking for a new partner? I smiled, looking at her new designer bag. It seemed Samuel had spent most of his compensation on her. What's wrong, Miss Eleanor? Your bag looks nice. Did a new company hire you, or did you use Samuel's hard-earned money? You! Eleanor, feeling wronged, looked at Samuel. But Samuel, reminded of his troubles, snapped at her. Enough, shut up. Haven't you caused enough trouble? He stormed off. Watching his retreating figure, I felt immense satisfaction. These moments nourished me, but it wasn't enough. I wanted more. Chapter 10. As the scandal spread, no company wanted to work with Samuel. People mocked the once promising entrepreneur. The compensation money was running out, and Eleanor was becoming restless. Without money, even the strongest relationship crumbled. The betrayal and career setbacks were driving Samuel mad. He started drinking heavily and even hitting Eleanor. One day, while pretending to work to support the family, I lay on my soft bed, watching them fight through the surveillance. Samuel slapped Eleanor hard, shouting, "Why did I ever choose you? Felicia knows how to support the family. You just ask for money." Eleanor retorted, "Now you think she's better? I didn't follow you to suffer. You're blaming me for your incompetence?" Her words provoked more violence. I was tired of watching their daily fights. Just as I was about to turn off the computer, I heard them plotting to sell my house. I perked up. The house was a gift from me to Samuel, with both our names on it. Now, he was finally targeting it. On screen, Samuel fantasized. "Felicia is so understanding. She'll forgive me. When I succeed, I'll buy the house back." I exhaled and made a call. Perhaps due to his bad luck, Samuel quickly found a real estate agent. The agent promised to transfer the money to his account immediately after the deal. But he asked Samuel to pick him up to see the house. Samuel, desperate, agreed without thinking. As soon as they left, I arrived with my team. Selling my house without my permission? He would pay for this. I grabbed a hammer and started smashing everything. I turned the house into a ruin. All the memories were gone. I felt I was close to ending this absurd relationship. When Samuel returned with the agent, they were shocked. Before they could react, the agent, following my instructions, beat them up. The reason? Deceiving him with a dilapidated house and wasting his time. Samuel, though confused, knew he was at fault. Exhausted, he didn't have the strength to call the police. Lying in the ruins, Samuel stared at the ceiling, feverish. Could Felicia have done this? Since she returned from the hospital, everything had changed. Chapter 11. Just when I thought there was nothing left to torment Samuel with, William handed me a test result. I was overjoyed. It was a successful match for my mother's bone marrow. Another plan formed in my mind. I returned to the ruined house, where Samuel was delirious with fever. I gave him fever medicine, and he slowly woke up. Seeing him awake, I cried, "Honey, what happened to our home? Did you offend someone? I spent all our money on your medicine. Felicia, every time I'm down, you're there." Samuel's eyes showed a hint of gratitude. "Honey, are you in the late stages of leukemia?" I covered my mouth to hide my smile. Samuel frowned, unsure how to tell me he had lied. I shook my head in pain and ran out. Outside, I made another call. Lying in bed, Samuel thought of Felicia's heartbreak over his illness. He hadn't expected her to truly love him. After graduating, Samuel, thinking he would never find true love, chose Felicia, who seemed suitable. But his beloved Eleanor had returned last year. He made the mistake many men make, but Felicia remained loyal. Thinking of this, Samuel's eyes seemed to glisten. Soon, Samuel received a call from Mr. Zachary. "Hey, business is back. Need money?" Hope sparked in Samuel's eyes, his fever seeming to subside. "Yes. But can I change the person?" Samuel asked cautiously. Mr. Zachary hadn't expected this, and neither had I. But I signaled him to continue. "Same as before." Mr. Zachary replied, glancing at me. I returned to the room, and Samuel excitedly told me we would have money soon. I knew he had given up on Eleanor. But my plan remained unchanged. The day for my mother's surgery arrived. I pretended to take Samuel to the hospital for a checkup. Once there, I revealed the real purpose. "Honey, someone is willing to donate bone marrow for you. Go for the surgery. Don't worry about the money." Samuel was shocked but couldn't resist. The doctors took him in. The surgery went smoothly. My mother was drained of her bone marrow and lay lifeless on the table. As for Samuel, I had the doctor sedate him for 2 hours. When he woke up, I joyfully held his hand. Honey, you're saved. The doctor said you're fine. Samuel, skeptical, let me lead him to the morgue. You must thank this kind person. I didn't expect them to step up. Samuel was confused. He had planned to sell Eleanor, but he was fine. How? He kept his doubts to himself. Facing the covered body, a voice in his head urged him to uncover it. Samuel stepped forward and lifted the sheet. He stumbled back, falling to the ground, his mouth opening and closing before he could speak. Mom? Mom? My mother had died in my place, leaving Samuel half mad. I sent the last call between Mr. Zachary and Samuel to Eleanor. What she would do to Samuel, I didn't know. But the evidence of their affair would appear in her records every time she applied for a job. Those who hurt me had received their punishment. Now, it was time to move forward.